And Jack and Yochai and Edan began a research seminar with some talented students to discuss the notion of the theory of and practice of access to knowledge. And together, they developed the concept of access to knowledge as a framing mechanism for talking about a range of issues, both how to gain access to knowledge, participation in human liberty. But he was careful not to talk about the access to knowledge as a human right. And he gave some reasons why. I think there were interesting reasons. But I would actually encourage you to say the R word and to treat access to knowledge in this conference both expressly as a human rights and as a human rights unit. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights expressly says, everyone has the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. Now, as you know, most countries in the world recognize the right of freedom to government information, but the human rights question is whether the right to receive, seek, and impart information through any media, regardless of frontiers, includes the right to private information that's being held under claims of intellectual property. And this, of course, then makes the right of access to private information a claim for some rights holders against others. And this means that this could trigger easily a counter movement. So given that there's claims of right on both sides, the task for international lawyers then becomes how to design a piece of law that balances the right to seek information with the right to hold and exploit it in a proprietary fashion. Now, until recently, the problem was those who wanted to have a right to information didn't have a strong idea. As Pam Samuelson said at last year's conference, the political economy of intellectual property debates had led to IP maximalism, expressed in a variety of institutions, including the United States Trade Representative. And as she said, those who favored the right of access to knowledge had some defensive victories, but didn't go on the offense. What last year's A2K conference did was it put you on the offense. It gave you a positive agenda, a positive conception of an information society in which you want to live. It gave roles for various players within that, particularly academics, to popularize insights, form research, and to bridge across interdisciplinary communities. And now, armed with this idea, an international legal process is beginning, starting with the Geneva Declaration on the Future of World Intellectual Property, and now the idea of an access to knowledge treaty, which would switch the default so that restrictions on access are the exception, not the rule, and so that exclusions, exceptions, and limitations to intellectual property are mandatory rather than permissive. And finally, a treaty that would speak not just of the rights of individual users, but also of structures that are intended to benefit open source models of information. Now that you have an idea and the elements of an instrument, a process is beginning. A development agenda that was first put on the table by Brazil and Argentina, an NGO process that's bringing it forward, a series of networks promoting it, which brings us to today. This conference, which is being held on the weekend of World Intellectual Property Day, will be a pivotal event in conceptualizing issues, mobilizing coalitions, setting agendas, and developing advocacy and policy strategies. Let me just suggest finally that in thinking about this debate from a human rights perspective, you should not simply think about access to knowledge as an end state right. You should think about access to knowledge as a means to human rights for others, and a right that can be fused with the existing human rights movement. This is no clearer than in the case of China. As you know, in China, the Cultural Revolution occurred behind closed doors. In Tiananmen Square in 1989, people were faxing for democracy. Now, despite all of the efforts of the Chinese government to restrict access to knowledge, internet freedom is evolving. But at the same time, limitations on internet freedom are being imposed by the Chinese government. Individuals are being detained and imprisoned for internet writings. private multinational enterprise are providing the Chinese government with equipment and technology to block sites. Foreign content providers are playing the role of government censor through the development of search engines. And the question is, will this be permitted, or will the access to knowledge movement put up the kind of struggle to bring down those barriers as well? In the end, it's pretty simple. As you heard from the young rascals many years ago, all the world over, it's so easy to see people everywhere just want to be free. People want to be free, information wants to be free, and when you fuse those two desires, the concept of the right of access to knowledge as a human right helps to fuse those movements. And so in the next few days, several processes will be playing out: a process of knowledge development, a process of network building, and a transnational legal process. Now it seems to me that this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish here at the YALE Law School. As Dean, my primary goals have been promoting globalization, public service, the building of professional ties, the building of a leader-scholarly agenda for the 21st century. I think they all come together in this conference. And what will develop from this, I hope, the beginnings of an access to knowledge treaty that can really promote the idea of access to knowledge as a human right. Now, as you know from the movies, a successful sequel is always harder to make than the original, but there is an exception. The Godfather 2 comes to mind. Let me say this is the business you've chosen, access to knowledge. Good luck in making this the most successful development of that idea that can be done. Welcome to 82K2.